In a peaceful suburban community, a group of young thugs mistake an elderly man tending to his prized orchids for an easy target. Their fatal error becomes apparent when the former military marksman's steady hands prove just as skilled with a hunting rifle as they once were with his service weapon. The quiet gardener's deadly accuracy serves as a chilling reminder that appearances can be fatally deceptive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening mist settled over Oak Ridge Gardens, a once prestigious plant nursery on the outskirts of Millbrook. Thomas Chen stood among his beloved orchids, his weathered hands gently supporting a rare Paphiopedilum hybrid. At 72, his movements remained precise and deliberate, each gesture reflecting decades of both military discipline and horticultural patience. The greenhouse's humid air carried the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers, masking the growing tension that had been building in the neighborhood. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the glass panels, casting long shadows across rows of carefully cultivated plants. Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his keen eyes noting the subtle signs of stress in a nearby phalaenopsis. Years of combat training had taught him to spot the smallest details, a skill that translated surprisingly well to nurturing delicate blooms. Detective Sarah Martinez's police cruiser rolled quietly past the nursery's entrance, its headlights briefly illuminating the hand-painted Chen's Rare Orchids sign. The local police had increased patrols since the Red Valley Gang had started expanding their territory into Millbrook's eastern district. Thomas acknowledged her presence with a slight nod, though his attention never left the plant before him. Inside the main greenhouse, Claire Wilson, Thomas's apprentice and sole employee, organized the day's orders. The 26-year-old botanist had started working at the nursery 3 years ago, drawn by Thomas's unparalleled expertise with rare species. She'd learned to read his moods, noting how his shoulders had tensed slightly when the police car passed, a subtle tell from a man who rarely displayed emotion. "The Yang's prize cattleya is ready for delivery," Claire called out, her voice echoing through the humid air. "Though I'm worried about sending it across town with all these gang sightings lately." Thomas carefully placed the Paphiopedilum back on its shelf. "The Red Valley boys aren't interested in orchids," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that decades in America hadn't entirely erased. "They're after a bigger game." What Thomas didn't mention was how he'd noticed increased activity around the nursery. Suspicious vehicles driving past at odd hours, young men with hard eyes studying the property's layout. He recognized predatory behavior when he saw it. 15 years as a Special Forces sniper had taught him that much. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since Thomas had purchased the property 20 years ago, following his retirement from the military. Back then, Millbrook's eastern district had been a quiet suburb, known for its garden shows and farmers' markets. The Chen family name had become synonymous with rare and exotic orchids, drawing collectors from across the country. Claire finished packing the last order, her movements careful but efficient. "Mr. Chen, did you see the graffiti on the Weber's grocery store this morning? Red Valley's marking their territory. They're getting bolder." Thomas moved to the storage room, where a locked cabinet held his gardening tools. Behind those tools, hidden from view, lay something else, a custom Remington 700 rifle, carefully maintained and rarely touched. Like his orchids, it represented years of refined skill and patience. "Territories change," Thomas replied, thinking of other conflicts in other places. "What matters is protecting what's precious." His hands unconsciously traced the outline of a faded photograph pinned to the wall, a younger version of himself in military gear, standing beside his spotter in the mountains of Afghanistan. The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening calm. Claire jumped, nearly dropping the ceramic pot she was holding. Thomas's reaction was different, his body instantly alert, muscles remembering responses honed by years of combat. The noise had come from the rare species greenhouse, where his most valuable orchids were kept. "Stay here," Thomas commanded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Call Detective Martinez." He moved silently toward the door, years of training taking over. The darkness outside was now complete, but Thomas had long ago memorized every inch of his property. Through the greenhouse glass, he could make out several figures moving among his plants. The beam of a flashlight swept across rows of carefully tended orchids, illuminating the red bandanas that marked the intruders as Red Valley members. They weren't being careful. Their movements were aggressive, entitled, as they knocked over pots and examined the expensive surveillance system Thomas had installed. "Old man's got some nice tech," one voice carried through the glass. "Bet he's got a nice safe somewhere too. These fancy flowers got to bring in some serious cash." Thomas watched as one of the gang members, barely more than a teenager, deliberately pushed over a shelf of blooming dendrobiums. The crash of breaking pots and the sight of years of careful cultivation, destroyed in an instant, caused something to shift in Thomas's chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was too hot, too quick. This was something colder, more familiar. The calm, focus that had once helped him maintain his shot over 3-day surveillance missions. Claire's voice whispered urgently behind him. "Police are on their way. What do we do?" Thomas noted how the gang members had positioned themselves. 5 visible, probably more watching the perimeter. Their movement suggested they were armed, though trying to be discreet about it. They were confident, relaxed, believing they were dealing with nothing more than an elderly gardener. "We wait," Thomas replied softly, his mind already calculating angles and distances. Sometimes the best way to protect a garden is to remove the weeds at the root. In the distance, police sirens began to wail. The gang members tensed, their flashlight beams dancing erratically across the greenhouse interior. Thomas remained perfectly still, his trained eye registering every detail, their ages, their weapons, their patterns of movement. He knew this was only the beginning. Red Valley hadn't come just to vandalize. They were testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. As the sirens grew closer, the intruders began their retreat, moving with the cockiness of youth who believed they were untouchable. One of them, clearly the leader, paused at the greenhouse door. He lifted his phone, recording the destruction they'd caused. "Message for you, old man," he called out, his voice carrying across the destroyed garden. "Red Valley owns Millbrook. Now, next time we visit, better have something more valuable than flowers to offer." Thomas watched them disappear into the darkness, his expression unchanged. Claire moved to begin cleaning up the destruction, but Thomas gently caught her arm. "Leave it," he said quietly. "Evidence." But his mind was already working on something else, calculating fields of fire, planning defensive positions, remembering techniques long unused but never forgotten. Detective Martinez arrived minutes later, her flashlight beam playing across the scene of destruction. She took in the broken pots, the ruined orchids, and Thomas's unnaturally calm demeanor with a professional eye. "This is the 3rd Red Valley incident this week," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "They're escalating, getting more aggressive. Mr. Chen, maybe it's time to consider selling. This area isn't what it used to be." Thomas knelt beside a broken pot, carefully lifting a damaged orchid. His hands, still steady as they'd been behind a rifle scope, gently examined the plant's roots. "My father survived the Cultural Revolution by hiding his prized orchids in cave systems outside Shanghai," he said quietly. "He taught me that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost." Martinez studied him carefully, noting something in his tone. "Just don't do anything drastic, Mr. Chen. We're increasing patrols, working on building a case against their leadership." Thomas nodded politely, but his mind was already elsewhere. In the storage room, behind his gardening tools, the Remington 700 waited. Like his orchids, it would require careful preparation, meticulous attention to detail. Red Valley had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed that age had dulled his skills, that decades of nurturing life had made him forget how to deal death. As Martinez completed her report, Thomas began mentally preparing for what he knew would come next. The gang would return, emboldened by their success. But next time, they would learn what every enemy he'd ever faced had discovered. Underestimating Thomas Chen was a fatal mistake. The night settled over the damaged greenhouse, the scent of broken flowers mixing with the evening mist. Thomas stood among his ruined orchids, his mind clear and focused. Some men, he knew, were like invasive species. They could only be stopped by complete removal. As he had in other gardens of war, Thomas Chen prepared to protect what was precious, one careful shot at a time. Dawn crept over Millbrook, painting the shattered greenhouse in shades of amber. Thomas Chen worked methodically among the wreckage, salvaging what orchids he could while cataloguing the destruction. His movements were precise, each gesture carrying the same focus he'd once used to assemble his rifle in pitch darkness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire arrived early, carrying fresh supplies and a determined expression. She stopped at the greenhouse entrance, taking in the full extent of the damage in daylight. Broken glass crunched beneath her feet as she made her way to where Thomas knelt beside a damaged cattleyar. "The Yang family called," she said softly. "They heard about what happened. They're worried about you, Mr. Chen." She paused, watching him carefully transplant a surviving orchid. "Everyone is." Thomas continued his work, his weathered hands moving with surgical precision. "The Yang should worry about their own business," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Red Valley won't stop with just one greenhouse. The sound of a motorcycle approaching drew their attention. Michael Reeves, a former Marine who ran the local Veterans Center, pulled up on his restored Harley. Thomas had known him for years. They shared the understanding that came from seeing similar shadows of war. "Heard about the trouble," Michael said, dismounting. His prosthetic leg caught the morning light as he approached. "Brought some extra. Security cameras, military grade." He studied the damage with a professional eye. "They'll be back, you know. Red Valley doesn't leave witnesses to their activities." Thomas nodded, recognizing the truth in Michael's words. He'd seen similar patterns in other conflicts: the initial probe, the show of force, then the elimination of potential threats. "They're expanding their territory," he observed, "using intimidation to drive out established businesses." Michael helped Claire clear away broken glass while Thomas retrieved his toolbox. As they worked, Michael shared what he'd learned through his connections. Red Valley wasn't just another street gang. They were organized, methodical. Their leader, a man known only as Bishop, had transformed them from common thugs into a disciplined criminal enterprise. "They've got someone backing them," Michael explained, his voice low. "Military training, professional equipment, the kind of support that comes with serious money." He glanced at Thomas. "The kind of precision that reminds me of stories I've heard about certain operations in Southeast Asia." Thomas's hands paused briefly over a broken pot. Few people knew about his missions before Afghanistan, classified operations that had required more than just marksmanship. "The past should stay buried," he said quietly, but his mind was already analyzing this new information. The morning progressed as they worked to restore order to the greenhouse. Detective Martinez arrived around noon, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Federal Agent James Cooper. "We're building a RICO case against Red Valley's leadership," Cooper explained, studying Thomas with keen interest. "Their pattern of expansion matches other organizations we're tracking. They're being guided by someone with extensive tactical experience. Thomas listened silently as Cooper outlined the broader investigation. Red Valley's activities extended far beyond simple vandalism. They were systematically taking control of key properties throughout the city's eastern district. Each location they targeted served a specific purpose in their larger operation. Your nursery, Mr. Chen, Cooper continued, sits at a strategic crossroads. Perfect visibility of major transport routes, isolated enough for privacy, legitimate business cover. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The kind of location someone with your background might appreciate. Thomas met Cooper's gaze steadily. I grow flowers, Agent Cooper, nothing more. Of course, Cooper replied smoothly, but if you should notice anything unusual beyond yesterday's incident, we'd appreciate being informed. He handed Thomas his card before departing with Martinez. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, Michael approached Thomas. He knows about your service record, he said quietly. The parts that aren't classified anyway. Thomas continued, working, but his mind was processing this new development. Cooper's interest suggested the situation was more complex than simple territorial expansion. The agent's careful references to Thomas's background indicated he suspected something larger was in play. Claire, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Mr. Chen, what aren't you telling me? I know you're not just a gardener, the way you move, the things you notice. She gestured to the precise documentation of the damage he'd been compiling. This isn't just about insurance claims, is it? Thomas studied his apprentice thoughtfully. In 3 years, she'd proven herself not just skilled with plants, but observant, dedicated. She deserved to know what she might be facing. Before I grew orchids, he began, leading them to his office, I had another garden. He opened a locked drawer, removing a worn photograph album. Inside were images from another life, younger versions of himself in various combat zones, always with the same rifle, always in elevated positions overlooking vast territories. I was a gardener of sorts, he continued, his voice distant with memory, removing threats before they could take root, protecting others from a distance. He turned to a specific photo, himself with a small team in an undisclosed location. Sometimes the best way to protect a garden is to eliminate the threats before they arrive. Michael nodded in understanding, but Claire looked troubled. You're not thinking of taking care of this yourself, are you? These aren't wartime targets, Mr. Chen. They're criminals, yes, but they're predators, Thomas corrected gently. Young, aggressive, but guided by someone who understands strategy, someone using them as pawns in a larger game. He closed the album carefully. In any garden, you must understand the nature of what you're dealing with before you can address it. The rest of the day was spent reinforcing the greenhouse's security. Michael installed the new cameras, while Thomas made subtle adjustments to the property's layout. Changes that appeared decorative but would channel any future intruders into predictable paths. As evening approached, Claire prepared to leave, still troubled by the day's revelations. Just be careful, Mr. Chen. Whatever you're planning, remember you're not alone in this. We care about what happens to you. Thomas watched her drive away, appreciating her concern, but knowing she couldn't understand. The skills that had made him an elite sniper, patience, precision, the ability to remain motionless for days while waiting for the perfect moment. These weren't just combat techniques. They were part of who he was, as fundamental as his love for nurturing rare orchids. Later, after Michael had departed and darkness settled over the nursery, Thomas made his way to the storage room. The Remington 700 waited behind its panel, along with other equipment he'd hoped never to use again. His hands moved automatically, checking each component with practiced efficiency. As he worked, his mind analyzed the situation with cold precision. Red Valley would return. Their type always did. But they were being guided by someone with military experience, Someone who understood tactical operations, that made them more dangerous, but also more predictable to someone who spoke their language. Thomas Chen had spent decades cultivating life, coaxing rare blooms from seemingly impossible conditions. But he hadn't forgotten his other skills, the ability to read terrain, to predict patterns, to wait with infinite patience for the perfect moment to act. His greenhouse had been violated, his life's work threatened. Like the rare orchids he protected, some things were worth fighting for. The night deepened around the nursery as Thomas completed his preparations. Tomorrow, he would continue his role as the elderly gardener, apparently cowed by the previous night's violence. But beneath that peaceful exterior, another kind of gardening would begin. The careful preparation for removing threats that threatened everything he'd built. In the distance, a police siren wailed briefly before falling silent. Thomas Chen stood in his darkened greenhouse, surrounded by the night-blooming orchids he'd spent years cultivating. Their subtle fragrance filled the air as he contemplated the choices ahead. Some men grew flowers, others removed weeds. He had always been capable of both. Morning fog clung to Millbrook's eastern district as Thomas Chen began his daily routine, though now each familiar task carried new purpose. As he inspected the repaired greenhouse panels, his trained eye noted optimal firing angles and potential cover positions. The arriving delivery trucks provided perfect concealment for surveillance equipment. Detective Martinez's police cruiser appeared earlier than usual, parking discreetly behind the nursery. She emerged looking troubled, dark circles under her, eyes suggesting a sleepless night. Thomas continued his work, waiting for her to speak first. "We had 3 more incidents last night," she said, watching him carefully prune a damaged orchid. "Red Valley's getting more aggressive. The Weber's grocery store was completely ransacked. Old man Weber's in the hospital, tried to stop them from burning his ledgers." Thomas's hands remained steady, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. David Weber had been one of his first customers, always bringing homemade dumplings in exchange for gardening advice. "How bad?" "Concussion, broken ribs. He's stable, but—" Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Chen, we've noticed something odd. Every business Red Valley's hit has refused our offer of protective surveillance, even the Webers. It's like they're afraid of something bigger than the gang." Before Thomas could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into the nursery's lot. Agent Cooper stepped out, accompanied by another federal agent whose bearing immediately registered with Thomas. Special Forces, probably Delta. The new agent's eyes performed the same automatic sweep of the surroundings that Thomas had done. Countless times. "Mr. Chen," Cooper called out, approaching the greenhouse, "I'd like you to meet Agent Jackson. He has some experience relevant to our situation." Jackson's handshake was brief, professional. "Interesting setup you have here, sir. Those new camera positions, very strategic. Almost like someone with tactical experience placed them." Thomas returned to his orchids. "My customers value their privacy. Security is important in any business." "Of course," Jackson replied, studying the greenhouse layout. "You know what else is interesting? Red Valley's pattern of expansion. Their operations show military precision, but their visible leadership is strictly street level, almost like they're being directed by someone with extensive combat experience." Thomas carefully removed a damaged leaf, his movements precise. "Young people learn quickly when motivated." "They do," Cooper interjected, "especially when taught by someone who knows irregular warfare, someone who understands how to use civilian infrastructure for tactical advantage." He gestured at the nursery's location. "Someone who recognizes the strategic value of certain properties." Before Thomas could respond, Claire arrived, carrying a stack of invoices. She faltered slightly at seeing the agents, but recovered quickly. "Mr. Chen, the Yangs called again. They're insisting on delivering their payment in person. Said it's important." Thomas nodded. Noting how Jackson's attention sharpened at this information, the agents departed shortly after, but their presence had confirmed Thomas's suspicions. This wasn't just about territorial expansion. Someone was using Red Valley for a more sophisticated operation. As the morning progressed, Michael arrived on his Harley, accompanied by another veteran Thomas recognized from the support center, Marcus Williams, former Army intelligence. Marcus moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to analyzing threats, his prosthetic arm a reminder of lessons learned the hard way. "Did some digging on Red Valley," Marcus said quietly, helping Claire organize shipping containers. The new tactics started 3 months ago, right after they acquired some interesting real estate, abandoned subway maintenance tunnels, old storage facilities. All properties with strategic value. Thomas continued his work, but his mind processed this information. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone with military experience was positioning assets throughout the district, using Red Valley as their visible front. "There's more," Marcus continued. "Every business they've hit connects to transport routes. The Weber's store, perfect distribution point. The old mechanic shop, excellent vehicle maintenance facility. They're not just taking territory. They're building infrastructure." Claire, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "The nursery. We deliver across state lines. Our vehicles pass through customs with minimal inspection because of our reputation." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "You're not just a target, Mr. Chen. You're a strategic asset." The afternoon brought Henry Yang, one of Thomas's oldest customers. The elderly businessman's usual jovial manner was replaced by barely concealed fear. He insisted on speaking to Thomas alone in the office. "They came to my restaurant last night," Yang said quietly, hands trembling slightly. "Not the gang members, others. Men who move like soldiers. They asked about you, about your background. They knew things, Thomas. Things about your service that aren't in any public record." Thomas absorbed this information silently. Yang continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They're offering protection to all the businesses in the district. But it's not protection. It's recruitment. They're building something big, using Red Valley as their public face." After Yang left, Thomas retreated to his private greenhouse, where his most delicate orchids grew. The rare blooms required perfect conditions, like setting up a sniper's. Nest success depended on controlling every variable. As he worked, he mentally mapped out the pattern of recent events. Someone with extensive military experience was building a sophisticated operation, using Red Valley's thuggish reputation as cover. They were systematically acquiring properties with strategic value, establishing infrastructure, and now they were moving to secure transportation routes. Claire found him there an hour later, her face pale. "Mr. Chen, I think I found something." She showed him her tablet, displaying property records. Every business Red Valley's hit. The ownership changed hands months ago. Shell companies, all leading back to a corporation registered in Singapore. Thomas studied the documents, recognizing the methodology. It was how certain agencies set up long-term operations, establishing cover identities and infrastructure. Well in advance, someone was building something significant right under the nose of local law enforcement. As evening approached, Thomas made his way to the storage room. Behind the hidden panel, he retrieved not just his rifle, but other equipment he'd hoped to never use again. Surveillance gear, tactical communications, specialized optics. Like tending his most demanding orchids, this operation would require patience and precise timing. Michael returned just before closing, his expression grim. "Word on the street. Red Valley's planning something big. Next 48 hours. They're calling in members from other territories." Thomas nodded, already formulating his response. "Claire, take tomorrow off. Visit your sister in the city." "But," she began to protest. "The most delicate orchids," Thomas said quietly, "must sometimes be moved to safety before you can deal with threats to the greenhouse." After they left, Thomas began his preparations in earnest. Like preparing soil for his rarest blooms, each element had to be perfect. He moved through the greenhouse, positioning equipment with the same precision he once used to establish sniper hides in foreign territories. The night settled over Millbrook's eastern district, broken occasionally by police sirens. In his darkened greenhouse, Thomas Chen checked his equipment one final time. The skills he'd learned in war had never really left him. They'd just been redirected to nurturing life instead of dealing death. Now, those same skills would be needed again. Tomorrow would bring violence to his peaceful nursery, but like the rare orchids he'd spent decades protecting, some things were worth fighting for. In the gentle humidity of his greenhouse, surrounded by the night-blooming flowers he'd cultivated so carefully, Thomas Chen prepared for war. The former sniper knew that every garden sometimes required pruning. Red Valley and their mysterious backers were about to learn that some gardeners were deadlier than others. The pre-dawn hours shrouded Millbrook's eastern district in darkness as Thomas Chen made his final preparations. His greenhouse, normally filled with the gentle sounds of humidity controls and circulation fans, now held a different kind of atmosphere. Behind carefully positioned orchid displays, surveillance equipment monitored every approach to the property. Michael arrived first, parking his Harley behind the supply shed. His military training showed in how he automatically checked sight lines and potential cover as he approached. Marcus intercepted some communications, he reported quietly. Red Valley's mobilizing. But there's something else. Private security contractors moving into positions throughout the district. Thomas continued adjusting a seemingly decorative trellis that actually concealed a high-end motion sensor. How many? At least 3. Teams, professional equipment, encrypted comms. These aren't street thugs, they're spec ops, maybe private military. Michael's prosthetic leg caught the first hint of dawn as he helped position plants to provide better cover. They're setting up observation posts around key properties. Detective Martinez's unmarked car rolled quietly past the nursery. Lights off. She'd agreed to maintain minimal police presence in the area, understanding that something bigger than gang violence was unfolding. The federal investigation had gone suspiciously quiet, suggesting higher-level involvement. Thomas moved through, his morning routine with practiced precision, each action calculated to appear normal to any watching eyes. But beneath the peaceful exterior of tending to his orchids, years of combat experience guided his every move. The first customer of the day was Mrs. Liu, an elderly woman who'd been buying orchids from Thomas for years. But today was different. Her hands trembled as she approached the counter. "They visited my son's restaurant last night," she whispered in Mandarin. Men in suits talking about investment opportunities and protection. They knew things about his business loans, his immigration status. She glanced nervously at the windows. They said everyone in the district will need to make a choice soon. Thomas thanked her in the same language, his mind processing this new information. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone was systematically taking control of the entire district's infrastructure, using both intimidation and financial pressure. By mid-morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Regular customers stayed away, likely warned off. Unmarked vehicles cruised past the nursery at regular intervals, their tinted windows concealing their occupants. Thomas noted each passage, recognizing the disciplined pattern of professional surveillance. Claire called around noon, her voice tight with concern. "Mr. Chen, I'm at my sister's place. The news is reporting gang activity throughout the city, but it's organized, coordinated. Military surplus vehicles have been spotted moving into position around Millbrook. Stay where you are," Thomas instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Some gardens need thorough weeding before they're safe for tending." No sooner had he hung up than Henry Yang's son, James, burst into the greenhouse. The young man's usually immaculate business suit was disheveled, his face lined with stress. "They're moving on all the businesses simultaneously," James reported, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Professional teams, forcing owners to sign partnership agreements. Those who refuse—" He swallowed hard. "The Weber family just sold their store for a fraction of its value. Mr. Weber's hospital room had some unexpected visitors last night." Thomas absorbed this information with outward calm, but his combat-trained mind was already analyzing the situation. This wasn't just about territorial control. Someone was executing a sophisticated operation to take over the entire district's economic infrastructure. As James left, Michael returned with Marcus. The intelligence veteran's prosthetic arm gleamed dully as he spread out a map showing recent property acquisitions. "Look at the pattern," Marcus pointed out. "They're not just taking over businesses, they're securing specific types of properties. Storage facilities, transportation hubs, properties with basement access to old utility tunnels. They're building something bigger than just a criminal enterprise." Thomas studied the map, recognizing the methodology. It was similar to how certain agencies established long-term operational bases in foreign territories, creating layers of legitimate cover while building hidden infrastructure. The afternoon brought more signs of the coming confrontation. Delivery trucks with suspicious timing patterns circled the area. Dark SUVs with military-grade communications equipment took up positions at strategic intersections. The usual street-level Red Valley members were nowhere to be seen, replaced by men whose movements screamed professional training. "They're isolating potential resistance points," Michael observed, helping Thomas move some of his most valuable orchids to a secure location. "Classic insurgency tactics. Identify and neutralize any possible opposition before the main operation begins." Thomas worked steadily, his actions appearing to focus on his plants, while his trained eye catalogued every detail of the increasing activity around his property. Like preparing for a long-range mission, success would depend on understanding every aspect of the operational environment. As evening approached, Detective Martinez made one final pass by the nursery. Her face was grim as she spoke to Thomas through the greenhouse window. "We've been ordered to minimize presence in the Eastern District tonight," she reported. "Orders from way above my pay grade. Whatever's coming, we've been told to stay out of it." She hesitated. "Mr. Chen, I know about your background. Just be careful. These aren't just gang members we're dealing with." Thomas nodded, appreciating her warning while knowing she couldn't understand the full scope of what was unfolding. The district wasn't just facing a criminal takeover, it was being systematically prepared for something much more significant. As darkness fell, Thomas made his final preparations. His greenhouse, normally a sanctuary of peace and growth, had been subtly transformed. Critical equipment was protected, escape routes established, and defensive positions prepared, all while maintaining the appearance of a simple plant nursery. The Remington 700 waited in its hidden compartment, along with other equipment from his past life. But Thomas knew this confrontation would require more than just marksmanship. He was facing an opponent who understood professional operations, someone using Red Valley and private military contractors as pieces in a larger game. Michael and Marcus departed reluctantly, understanding that Thomas needed the property clear for what would come next. Like preparing his most delicate orchids for pollination, timing would be crucial. In the growing darkness, Thomas Chen moved silently through his greenhouse. The night-blooming orchids released their subtle fragrance, a reminder of the life he'd chosen to cultivate after years of dealing death. But sometimes, protecting life requires visiting old skills. The district had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual evening traffic replaced by an ominous stillness. In the distance, dogs barked nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Thomas checked his equipment one final time, each movement precise and practiced. Tomorrow would bring violence to his peaceful nursery, but like the rare flowers he'd spent decades protecting, some things were worth fighting for. In the humid darkness of his greenhouse, surrounded by the blooms he'd cultivated so carefully, Thomas Chen prepared to show his enemies why underestimating a gardener with a sniper's training was a fatal mistake. The night deepened as he completed his preparations. Sometimes he knew the most dangerous predator was the one that appeared harmless. His enemies were about to learn that some gardeners were deadlier than others, and that the skills of warfare, like the cultivation of rare orchids, never truly fade away. Midnight passed over Millbrook's eastern district like a held breath. Thomas Chen moved silently through his greenhouse, checking motion sensors hidden among his prized orchids. The humidity that kept his flowers thriving would affect bullet trajectories, a detail that hadn't mattered to him since Afghanistan, but now required careful calculation. His radio crackled softly. Marcus, monitoring communications from a safe distance. Multiple vehicles moving into position. Professional formations, definitely military trained. They're establishing a perimeter around the entire block, Thomas acknowledged with a single click, already noting the subtle shifts in shadow as dark figures took up positions around his property. Their movement patterns confirm Michael's intelligence. These weren't gang members, but private military contractors executing a coordinated operation. The first direct contact came at 2 a.m. A polished voice cut through his greenhouse's silence, carried by an expensive speaker system. "Mr. Chen, my name is Victor Kane. I believe it's time we had a conversation about the future of your property." Thomas continued his work, seemingly absorbed in tending to a delicate Vanda orchid. Through carefully positioned mirrors, he tracked movement outside, at least 12 operators in tactical gear using professional cover formations. "Your reputation precedes you," Kane continued. 15 years in special forces, specialized in long-range reconnaissance. Then a remarkable transformation into one of the country's most respected orchid cultivators. It's an impressive second act. The voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to power. But Thomas detected something else, the subtle indicators of a man with military background, probably special operations. This wasn't just a criminal takeover, it was something more sophisticated. "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something significant," Kane pressed. "Your nurseries. Distribution network, combined with your unique background, makes you an ideal partner. The others have already agreed to our terms. There's no need for unpleasantness." A sudden movement caught Thomas's eye. One of Kane's men had slipped inside the eastern greenhouse. The intruder's movements were professional, disciplined, but he didn't understand how Thomas had redesigned the interior. Like cultivating rare orchids, preparing a battlefield required intimate knowledge of the environment. Thomas triggered a remote switch. Powerful grow lights blazed to life, momentarily blinding the intruder. In the same instant Thomas moved. 15 years of nurturing plants hadn't dulled his combat reflexes. The operator went down silently, efficiently disarmed and restrained. Before he could alert his team. "Impressive," Kane's voice carried a new edge, "but ultimately futile. The district's changing, Mr. Chen. We've spent months preparing, shell companies acquiring properties, establishing infrastructure, building relationships with key officials. Your interference is becoming problematic." Thomas secured the unconscious. Operator, noting his equipment, latest generation tactical gear, encrypted communications, specialized breaching tools. This was no ordinary criminal enterprise. The level of preparation and equipment suggested state-level backing. His radio clicked twice, Marcus's warning signal. More vehicles were approaching, heavy ones. Through the greenhouse glass, Thomas caught glimpses of armored SUVs taking up position. They were establishing a serious containment perimeter. "You have 1 hour to consider our offer," Kane announced. "After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action. I'd prefer to avoid damaging such valuable infrastructure, but business requires difficult decisions." Thomas moved to his office, activating surveillance feeds Michael had helped install. The cameras revealed the full scope of Kane's operation: multiple tactical teams, advanced communications equipment, even a mobile command center disguised as a utility truck. They were setting up for a professional breach and clear operation. His phone vibrated. A text from Detective Martinez. "Federal Task Force just ordered all units to clear the area. Whatever's happening, it's sanctioned from above. Be careful." Thomas absorbed this information with the same calm he used when dealing with his most challenging orchid cultivars. Kane's operation had official protection, suggesting connections reaching into federal agencies. This wasn't just about controlling territory. They were establishing a sophisticated operational base under the cover of gang activity. Moving to his storage room, Thomas retrieved his Remington 700. The rifle had waited patiently behind its panel, like a dormant orchid waiting for the right conditions to bloom. His hands moved through the familiar checks automatically, muscle memory unchanged by years of peaceful cultivation. The captured operator's radio crackled with coded communications. Thomas listened carefully, his military experience translating the professional shorthand. They were positioning for a coordinated breach, multiple entry points, synchronized teams. Kane wasn't taking chances. "Your reputation in the orchid world is remarkable," Kane's voice returned, carrying calculated admiration. "You understand that success requires creating perfect conditions, controlling every variable. We're offering the same opportunity on a larger scale. Your expertise, combined with our resources, could build something extraordinary." Thomas continued his preparations, his movements economical and precise. Like preparing his rarest orchids for showing, every detail mattered. He'd spent years designing his greenhouses to create perfect growing conditions. Now, those same design elements would serve a different purpose. The humidity controls could reduce visibility. The irrigation system could make floors treacherously slick. Carefully positioned growing lights could provide disorienting illumination. Even the dense orchid displays offered both cover and concealment. His radio clicked 3 times, Marcus's highest warning signal. The tactical teams were in final position. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched them move with professional precision. Kane had assembled a formidable force, easily 20 operators with military-grade equipment. "Time's up, Mr. Chen," Kane announced. "Last chance for a peaceful resolution. The district's transformation is inevitable. The only question is whether you'll profit from it or become another casualty of progress." Thomas made his final adjustments. Like preparing for a critical pollination, timing would be essential. He'd positioned his most valuable orchids in a secure greenhouse, protecting them from what was to come. Now his nursery would serve a different purpose, becoming a battlefield where his past and present skills would combine. The first breach came simultaneously from multiple points. Explosive charges shattered greenhouse glass as tactical teams moved in with professional coordination. But Thomas had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous attention he gave to cultivating his rarest blooms. Remote triggers activated pre-positioned irrigation systems, instantly creating hazardous conditions. Tactical lights, carefully arranged among the orchid displays, provided disorienting illumination. The greenhouse's humid atmosphere, perfect for orchids, now worked against the intruder's thermal imaging equipment. From his elevated position, Thomas watched through his scope as Kane's professional operation began to encounter the challenges of fighting in a carefully prepared environment. Like nurturing a difficult species, success depended on understanding and controlling every aspect of the surroundings. The night exploded into chaos as Thomas Chen prepared to demonstrate why underestimating a gardener with combat experience was a fatal mistake. His greenhouse, designed for nurturing life, was about to become a killing ground where old skills would bloom again. The greenhouse erupted into calculated chaos as Thomas Chen's years of preparation merged with decades of combat experience. Like tending his most demanding orchids, each element had been precisely positioned for maximum effect. The first tactical team breached through the western greenhouse, their movements professional but hampered by the unfamiliar terrain. Thomas had spent years arranging his orchid displays to create optimal growing conditions. Now those same arrangements channeled the intruders into predetermined paths. Teams 2 and 3 pushed through the central corridor. Kane's voice crackled through the captured radio. Be advised, the target has extensive combat experience. Expect prepared positions. Thomas moved silently among his elevated growing platforms, his knowledge of every creaking board and shifting shadow providing an overwhelming advantage. The first operator rounded a corner, night vision gear struggling with the artificial mist from the irrigation systems. Thomas's strike was swift and precise. The man went down before he could radio a warning. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas tracked the tactical team's movements. Kane had committed at least 20 operators to the assault, their formations, suggesting extensive military training, but they were fighting on his territory, among the blooms he'd spent years cultivating. Contact lost with Johnson, a tense voice reported over the radio. Team 2, check his last known position. Thomas triggered another set of growing lights, the sudden illumination disrupting night vision equipment. In the confusion, he moved to a new position, the skills that had once made him an elite sniper flowing seamlessly into this close-quarters combat. The humid air carried the scent of broken orchids mixed with cordite as Kane's men attempted to establish a secure perimeter. But Thomas had designed his greenhouse complex like a living maze, seemingly straightforward paths that led to carefully prepared kill zones. Be advised, Kane's voice held a new edge of frustration. Target is using environmental controls against us. Switch to thermal imaging. But Thomas had prepared for this. The greenhouse's ambient humidity and carefully regulated temperature gradients played havoc with thermal sensors. Like creating the perfect conditions for his most delicate species, he designed his battleground to neutralize every tactical advantage. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the relative quiet. One of Kane's teams had encountered a defensive position, but found only carefully positioned orchid displays. The wasted ammunition and noise worked to Thomas's advantage, masking his movement to a new location. This isn't just a nursery, Kane broadcast, his voice carrying through the greenhouse. We've seen the shipping manifest, Chen. The unusual delivery patterns, the specialized equipment. You're running something more sophisticated than flowers. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile as he disabled another operator. Kane wasn't entirely wrong. The nursery's legitimate business had required specialized importing licenses and discretion in handling rare species. But he'd never used that infrastructure for anything beyond his orchids. The sound of breaking glass announced another team's entry point. Thomas triggered his next set of preparations. The irrigation system, modified for this moment, released a fine mist that reduced visibility to mere feet. In the artificial fog, Kane's professional operators were reduced to moving blindly through unfamiliar territory. Sir, a strained voice reported, we've lost contact with teams 2 and 4. Something's wrong with our thermals, and the target knows this place too well. Thomas moved methodically through his greenhouse, each action as precise as grafting a delicate orchid. Kane's men were professionals, but they didn't understand how years of nurturing life had enhanced rather than dulled his combat skills. The Patience required for cultivating rare blooms translated perfectly to this deadly game of cat and mouse. Outside, more vehicles arrived. Through the greenhouse's humid air, Thomas caught glimpses of heavy equipment being positioned. Kane was escalating, preparing to breach with more direct methods. Enough games. Kane's voice carried real anger. Now, you're surrounded by superior forces, facing an opponent who understands both military operations and business realities. This isn't a battlefield where your old skills matter. But Thomas knew differently. Every greenhouse, every carefully positioned plant display, every maintenance access point had been designed with multiple purposes in mind. Like preparing his orchids for optimal growth, he'd created an environment he completely controlled. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports. Kane's professional operators were being systematically neutralized, their military training insufficient against an opponent who had turned his entire nursery into an elaborate trap. Team 1, fall back to secondary positions, Kane ordered. Prepare for Phase 2 breach. Target is more resourceful than anticipated. Thomas used the respite to make his way to a pre-positioned observation point. Through carefully placed mirrors, he watched Kane's remaining forces regroup. Their equipment and tactics confirmed his suspicions. This was a professional military operation hiding behind the cover of gang activity. His phone vibrated silently. A message from Michael. Police scanner shows heavy equipment moving into the district. Whatever they're planning, it's big. The distant sound of diesel engines confirmed the warning. Kane was bringing in serious hardware, preparing to escalate beyond tactical teams to heavy equipment. The night was about to become more complicated. Last chance, Chen, Kane broadcast. We're prepared to level this entire complex if necessary. Your orchids, your life's work, all of it can be preserved if you cooperate. Thomas checked his equipment with the same attention he gave to monitoring his most sensitive plants. Kane's threat was tactically sound. Facing a prepared defender in close quarters, the logical escalation was to destroy the defensive position entirely. But like nurturing his rarest specimens, Thomas had prepared for multiple contingencies. The greenhouse complex wasn't just his battleground. It was an environment he had spent years perfecting, understanding every aspect from humidity levels to structural weaknesses. The sound of heavy vehicles positioning around the nursery perimeter grew louder. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas spotted armored equipment being moved into place. Kane was preparing for a major breach, probably intending to simply crush the greenhouses and everything in them. "Sir," a nervous voice reported over the captured radio, "local news vans are approaching the area. We've got civilian attention incoming." Kane's response was immediate and profane. His operation relied on secrecy, using Red Valley's gang activities as cover. Media attention would complicate his plans significantly. Thomas used the momentary distraction to move to his next prepared position. Like transplanting a delicate orchid, timing and precision were crucial. Kane's forces were professional and well-equipped, but they were fighting on his territory, among the blooms he'd spent years cultivating. The night air carried the mixed scents of orchids and cordite as Thomas Chen prepared for the next phase of the confrontation. His greenhouse, designed for nurturing life, had become a deadly maze where his past and present skills combined perfectly. Kane's voice crackled through the radio again, this time addressing his teams. "Prepare for a full breach. If we can't take this position cleanly, we'll take it down entirely. Chen's expertise isn't worth this level of compromise." But Thomas knew something Kane didn't. Like the rarest orchids that bloomed only under perfect conditions, some victories required patience, precision, and intimate knowledge of the environment. The night was far from over, and he had yet to reveal all his preparations. The sound of heavy equipment moving into position echoed through the humid air as Thomas made his final adjustments. Sometimes, he knew, protecting a garden required more. than just tending to flowers. Some threats needed to be eliminated entirely. The rumble of heavy equipment shook the greenhouse foundations as Kane prepared his next assault. Thomas Chen moved like a shadow through his carefully curated environment, each step calculated with the same precision he used when handling his most delicate orchids. "All teams, prepare for synchronized breach," Kane's voice crackled through the captured radio. "Engineering units in position. On my mark, we collapse the entire structure." Thomas watched through his surveillance feeds as armored vehicles took up position around the nursery complex. Kane had brought in serious demolition equipment, the kind used for rapid clearing of fortified positions. Like preparing for an unexpected frost, Thomas had planned for this contingency. His phone vibrated. A text from Marcus. "News vans 2 blocks out. Police scanner shows multiple media outlets responding to anonymous tips about military activity in civilian areas." A slight smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. Claire, despite his instructions to stay away, had found a way to help. The approaching media coverage would complicate Kane's operation significantly. "Sir," an urgent voice reported over the radio, "we've got problems. Channel 7 News is setting up live coverage. They're calling it a military-style assault on local business." Kane's response was immediate and harsh. "Shut them down. Use Red Valley members if necessary. We need to maintain operational security." But Thomas knew the situation had already shifted. Like managing a delicate cross-pollination, timing was everything. Kane's need for secrecy would force him to either withdraw or act immediately. The decision came quickly. "All teams execute full breach now. Engineering units commence demolition. We'll deal with the media fallout after we secure the package." Thomas moved to his primary position as the first armored vehicle engaged its ram. The greenhouse complex shuddered, but didn't collapse. Like cultivating his strongest orchids, Thomas had reinforced his structure over years of careful preparation. "Something's wrong," a voice reported. "Structures reinforced beyond blueprint specifications. Standard breach isn't working." Thomas triggered his next set of preparations. The irrigation system, modified for this moment, released a carefully prepared mixture. The liquid made the ground treacherously slick, hampering the heavy equipment's maneuverability. Through his scope, Thomas watched Kane's operation begin to unravel. The professional precision was breaking down as media attention and unexpected resistance disrupted their carefully planned assault. "All units, be advised," Kane's voice carried barely controlled fury. "Target has military-grade countermeasures in place. This isn't just a nursery. We're dealing with a prepared defensive position." Thomas moved silently to his next location. The skills that had made him an elite sniper hadn't faded. They'd merely been redirected to more peaceful pursuits. Now those same abilities, patience, precision, absolute control, served him in protecting what he'd built. The greenhouse erupted in chaos as Kane's forces attempted to breach from multiple points simultaneously. But Thomas had designed his environment like a living organism, each section supporting the others. The seemingly decorative arrangement of rare orchids created natural barriers and channeled movement along predictable paths. "Team 3, we've lost contact with the engineering unit," a strained voice reported. "Their equipment is disabled. Some kind of chemical agent in the irrigation system." Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The same careful attention to pH levels and chemical balance that his orchids required had provided an unexpected tactical advantage. Kane's voice cut through the confusion. "Chen, you think you're clever using your gardening knowledge as a weapon? We have satellite data on your operation, the unusual power consumption, specialized equipment, irregular shipping patterns. This isn't just about orchids." Moving between his growing platforms, Thomas spotted Kane's position, a mobile command center disguised as a utility truck. The man's silhouette was visible briefly, his bearing confirming Thomas's suspicions about his military background. "Sir," Another voice broke in. "We've got multiple news helicopters incoming. Social media's picking up the story. Local authorities are demanding explanations for military-grade equipment in civilian areas." The night air carried the scent of broken orchids and hydraulic fluid as Kane's operation continued to deteriorate. Like managing a greenhouse during a storm, Thomas had prepared for every contingency. His radio clicked twice, Michael's signal. The veteran had positioned himself to monitor the perimeter, police scanners going crazy, FBI's demanding explanation for unauthorized paramilitary activity. Someone high up is asking very loud questions. Thomas triggered another set of preparations. Emergency lighting activated, bathing the greenhouse complex in harsh illumination. Perfect for the news helicopters now hovering overhead, their cameras capturing Kane's military-style assault on a civilian business. "Shut it down," Kane ordered, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Fall back to secondary positions. Maintain cover as utility workers responding to infrastructure emergencies." But Thomas knew the situation had evolved beyond Kane's control. Like nurturing a rare bloom to flower, all the elements had come together perfectly. The media presence, the failed breach attempt, the questions from authorities. Kane's carefully planned operation was exposed. "This isn't over, Chen," Kane broadcast on an encrypted channel. "You've prepared well, but you can't protect your nursery forever. There are other ways to acquire assets." Thomas remained silent, watching through his scope as Kane's forces began. A professional withdrawal. The heavy equipment was being quickly disguised as utility vehicles, the tactical teams disappearing into unmarked vans. Detective Martinez's cruiser appeared at the perimeter, lights flashing. She emerged with a megaphone, playing her part perfectly. "This is the police. We have reports of unauthorized paramilitary activity in a civilian area." The news helicopters captured everything. The military-grade equipment, the tactical teams, attempting to disappear, the evidence of a sophisticated operation targeting a simple nursery. Kane's cover was thoroughly blown. Thomas moved to secure his greenhouse as the last of Kane's forces withdrew. Like assessing damage after a storm, he began cataloging what needed repair. The structure had held, his preparations proving effective against both tactical teams and heavy equipment. His phone buzzed, a message from Claire. Local news running story about private military contractors targeting small businesses. Federal investigation launched into unauthorized paramilitary activities. The night air began to clear as emergency vehicles arrived. Thomas watched from the shadows as Detective Martinez coordinated with newly arrived federal agents. Different ones than before, asking very different questions. Michael's Harley rumbled up to the greenhouse. "Scanners going crazy," he reported. "Kane's operation kicked over a hornet's nest. Too many agencies asking questions about military-grade equipment. Being used against civilian targets?" Thomas nodded, already focusing on repairing damaged orchid displays. Like recovering from any threat to his plants, the work of restoration would require patience and precision. The greenhouse, designed for nurturing life, had proved equally effective as a defensive position. But Thomas knew this wasn't over. Kane's operation, whatever its true purpose, would adapt and try again. As dawn approached, Thomas Chen returned to tending his orchids. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper had helped protect his life's work, but the real victory lay in the flowers that had survived the night's violence. Sometimes, he reflected, the best way to win a fight was to let your enemy defeat himself. Like cultivating his rarest blooms, success often came from creating the right conditions and waiting patiently for things to develop naturally. The morning sun rose over Millbrook's eastern district, illuminating a greenhouse complex that had withstood a military-grade assault. Thomas Chen, elderly gardener and former sniper, prepared for another day of tending his orchids, knowing that some battles were won not with bullets, but with patience, preparation, and perfect timing. The morning after Kane's assault, Thomas Chen's greenhouse complex became the center of unwanted attention. News vans lined the street while federal agents combed the property for evidence, their presence disrupting the delicate routine his orchids required. Detective Martinez coordinated with FBI investigators, her expression grim as she approached Thomas. Kane's operation went dark completely. Professional cleanup. They're erasing all traces of their presence in the district, but they left something behind. She handed him a file marked classified. Thomas reviewed the documents while tending to a damaged phalaenopsis. The papers revealed fragments of a larger operation: shell companies, property acquisitions, sophisticated logistics networks, all being established under the cover of gang activity. "They're building something," Michael observed, helping Thomas repair a broken irrigation line, using Red Valley as cover to create infrastructure for something bigger. The nursery wasn't their real target. They wanted your distribution network. Thomas worked methodically, his hands steady as he reconnected vital systems. Like rehabilitating damaged orchids, recovering from the attack required careful attention to detail. But his mind processed the deeper implications of Kane's operation. Agent Cooper arrived mid-morning, his demeanor markedly different from before. "Mr. Chen, we need to talk about what really happened here." He surveyed the damage with a professional eye. This wasn't just about property acquisition. Kane's operation suggests state-level backing. Through the greenhouse glass, Thomas watched. Federal teams documenting evidence of military-grade equipment. The morning sun revealed impact marks from breaching charges, chemical residue from specialized weapons, signs of a sophisticated assault that had nothing to do with ordinary gang activity. Claire returned despite Thomas's objections immediately, beginning to catalog damaged plants. "The Yang family called," she reported quietly. "Similar teams hit their restaurant last night, but pulled back when the media coverage of your situation exploded. They're scared, Mr. Chen." "Everyone is." Thomas continued his work, each movement precise as he assessed his greenhouse's wounds. Like nurturing his most delicate species, recovery would require perfect conditions. But Kane's attack had revealed a larger threat to everything he'd built. "We've identified some of Kane's operators," Cooper continued, showing Thomas surveillance. "Photos. Former special forces, private military contractors, some with links to classified operations. This goes deeper than we thought." The greenhouse hummed with activity as federal teams documented evidence. Thomas moved among them like a shadow, his attention seemingly focused on his plants, while his trained mind analyzed every detail. His phone buzzed, Marcus sharing intercepted communications. Kane's organization was regrouping, adapting their strategy after the failed assault. The message confirmed Thomas's suspicions. This wasn't over. "They'll try again," Michael said, helping secure a damaged panel. "Different approach, but same. Objective. Kane's operation is too well-funded, too professional to abandon their plans." Thomas nodded, gently supporting a broken orchid stem. Like preparing for seasonal changes, he knew the importance of anticipating future challenges. Kane's next move would be more subtle, more insidious. Detective Martinez returned with more intelligence. Red Valley's original leadership is gone, replaced by professional operators. They're transforming the gang into something else, using their reputation as cover for sophisticated operations. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas monitored increased activity throughout the district. Kane's forces had withdrawn, but their infrastructure remained, hidden networks waiting to be reactivated. "The nursery's legitimate," Cooper acknowledged, studying Thomas's import licenses. "But your distribution system, your special handling, permits for rare species. It's perfect cover for moving sensitive materials." Kane's people did their homework. Thomas continued working, his movements deliberate as he repaired crucial systems. Years of nurturing rare blooms had taught him to see patterns, to understand how small changes could indicate larger developments. Claire organized volunteers from the community, helping restore damaged areas. "The Weber family's back," she reported. "Others too. They're saying if you can stand up to these people, so can they." But Thomas recognized the danger in their defiance. Like protecting delicate orchids from harsh conditions, the community would need careful preparation for what was coming. His radio clicked, Michael's warning signal. More unmarked vehicles were moving into the district, establishing surveillance positions. Kane's operation was adapting, shifting to a longer-term strategy. "They're not just after property," Cooper explained, sharing classified intelligence. "They're establishing a sophisticated network. Transportation, storage, distribution, all hidden behind legitimate businesses. Your nursery was a key piece of their puzzle." Thomas studied the patterns emerging from federal investigations. Like understanding the complex relationships between orchid species, he saw how different elements of Kane's operation connected. "Sir?" Claire interrupted, her face concerned. "The Yang's son James is here. Says it's urgent." James Yang entered, the greenhouse looking haunted. "They're offering new partnerships," he reported. "Different approach, all legitimate on paper. But the implications are clear. Cooperate or face market pressures." Thomas absorbed this information while examining a damaged cattleyas. Kane was shifting tactics, using economic pressure instead of direct force. Like adapting to changing environmental conditions, the threat was evolving. "We've got movement," Marcus radioed. "Professional teams establishing surveillance throughout the district. They're settling in for long-term observation." Cooper shared satellite imagery, showing patterns of activity across Millbrook's Eastern District. Properties acquired through shell companies were being quietly fortified, infrastructure modified for unknown purposes. "They're not leaving," Martinez observed, "just changing my approach, using legitimate businesses as cover for something bigger." Thomas continued his careful work, each movement precise as he restored his greenhouse's systems. Like nurturing rare species, protecting his community would require patience, planning, and perfect timing. The greenhouse humidity carried the scent of damaged orchids, mixed with industrial chemicals from the assault. Thomas Chen moved through. His domain, outwardly focused on repairs, while his combat-trained mind processed tactical realities. Kane's operation had revealed its sophistication, but also its vulnerabilities. Like cultivating his most challenging species, success would require understanding both strengths and weaknesses. As federal teams completed their investigation, Thomas prepared for the next phase of the conflict. Kane's forces would return, using different methods but pursuing the same objective. Like protecting rare blooms from persistent threats, defending his community would require constant vigilance. The morning sun illuminated a greenhouse complex that had withstood military assault, but Thomas knew the real battle was just beginning. Some threats, like certain orchid diseases, required long-term strategies to overcome. His phone buzzed with another warning from Marcus. More shell companies acquiring properties, more professional operators moving into position. Kane was preparing for a different kind of warfare. Thomas Chen continued his work, each movement deliberate and precise. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper now served two purposes: nurturing life and preparing to protect it from sophisticated threats. The greenhouse would recover, its delicate blooms surviving despite the violence. But like tending his most demanding orchids, Thomas knew that maintaining peace would require both patience and deadly precision. As the day progressed, he catalogued damage while planning countermeasures. Kane's next move would be more subtle, but Thomas had spent decades perfecting the art of patient observation. Like nurturing rare species, victory would come through careful preparation and perfect timing. The week following Kane's failed assault brought deceptive calm to Millbrook's Eastern District. Thomas Chen worked steadily to restore his greenhouse, each repair concealing additional preparations, like nurturing orchids that bloomed only under imperfect conditions. He knew timing would be crucial in what was to come. Michael arrived early, his prosthetic leg gleaming in the morning sun. "Kane's people are moving back into position," he reported, helping Thomas install reinforced panels. "Different approach this time. They're establishing legitimate businesses as fronts, import companies, logistics firms, security consultants." Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas monitored increased activity throughout the district. Professional operators had replaced the usual Red Valley gang members, their movements suggesting military training despite their civilian cover. "They've acquired 3 more properties this week," Claire reported, organizing shipping manifests. "All through different shell companies, all strategic locations," she paused, studying a document. "Mr. Chen, they're particularly interested in businesses with international shipping licenses." Thomas continued his work, each movement precise as he tended to his recovering orchids. The damage from Kane's assault had been severe, but like all living things, his greenhouse was adapting, becoming stronger. Detective Martinez's unmarked car pulled up outside. She entered looking troubled, carrying new intelligence. "Federal investigation's been quietly redirected," she said. "Someone's applying pressure from above. Kane's organization has serious backing." Thomas nodded, gently supporting a damaged dendrobium. The pattern was becoming clear. Kane's operation was shifting from brute force to sophisticated infiltration, using legitimate channels to establish control. "They're targeting all the independent businesses," Marcus radioed from his observation. "A post, offering partnerships, investments, protection. Those who refuse face systematic pressure, supply problems, permit issues, unexpected inspections." Through his greenhouse glass, Thomas watched unmarked vehicles cruise past at regular intervals. Kane's surveillance was professional, patient. Like cultivating rare species, they were creating specific conditions for their operation to flourish. "The Yang family's restaurant failed 3 health inspections this week," Claire reported. "Completely bogus violations. They're being pressured to sell to one of Kane's shell companies." Thomas worked methodically, his combat-trained mind analyzing patterns while his hands tended to delicate blooms. Kane's new strategy was more dangerous than direct assault, a slow strangulation of independent businesses using legitimate channels. Agent Cooper arrived mid-morning, his presence unofficial. "Kane's organization is sophisticated," he said, quietly. "They're establishing infrastructure for something bigger than local control. Your nursery's international connections make it particularly valuable." Thomas continued his careful work, each movement deliberate as he positioned plants to conceal new security measures. Like preparing his most sensitive orchids for challenging conditions, he was quietly fortifying his domain. "They've hired private security firms," Michael reported, helping install hidden cameras. "Professional contractors providing protection services to businesses in the district, but they're really establishing surveillance networks." Through carefully positioned mirrors, Thomas monitored increased activity around his property. Kane's operators maintained civilian cover, but their movements betrayed military training. Claire organized shipping records, her expression concerned. "They're specifically targeting businesses with import licenses," she noted, "creating a network of legitimate companies with international shipping capabilities." Thomas nodded, understanding the implications. Kane wasn't just seeking territorial control. He was building infrastructure for sophisticated operations, using legitimate businesses as cover. His phone buzzed, Marcus sharing intercepted communications. Kane's organization was systematically acquiring properties along major transportation routes, establishing a network of seemingly independent businesses. "The Weber family's store is under pressure," Detective Martinez reported. "Suppliers suddenly canceling contracts, deliveries." going missing, insurance rates skyrocketing, they're being squeezed out systematically. Thomas worked steadily, his movements precise as he tended to his orchids while analyzing tactical developments. Kane's operation was creating a sophisticated network, using economic pressure instead of violence to achieve their objectives. "They're offering me a job," Claire said suddenly, her voice tight. "A consulting position with one of their front companies, triple my current salary, plus benefits." She met Thomas's eyes. "They're trying to get inside information about the nursery's operations." Thomas continued his work, outwardly focused on his plants, while his mind processed this new development. Like protecting rare species from invasive threats, defending against Kane's operation required understanding all vectors of attack. Cooper shared classified intelligence, showing patterns of similar operations in other cities. They establish networks of legitimate businesses, create sophisticated infrastructure, then use it for their real objectives. Your nursery's international shipping licenses make it particularly valuable. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched professional operators establish observation posts throughout the district. Kane's forces were settling in for long-term operations, using legitimate covers to mask their true purpose. "The community's scared," Martinez observed. "Kane's people are applying pressure through official channels, health inspections, permit reviews, tax audits. They're using the system against independent businesses." Thomas worked methodically, each movement calculated as he restored his greenhouse while preparing for future conflicts. Like nurturing his most demanding orchids, protecting his community would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. His radio clicked. Michael's warning signal. More professional operators were moving into position, establishing surveillance. Under cover of legitimate business activities, Kane's operation was creating a sophisticated web of control. "They're not just watching the nursery," Marcus reported. "They're mapping all your connections, suppliers, customers, shipping partners, building a complete profile of your operation's capabilities." Thomas continued his careful work, outwardly focused on recovery, while his combat-trained mind analyzed patterns. Kane's organization was creating multiple pressure points, seeking weaknesses to exploit. Claire organized international shipping documents, her movements careful. "They're particularly interested in our rare species import licenses," she noted, "the permits that allow us to bypass certain customs inspections." Thomas nodded, understanding the strategic value. His nursery's legitimate need to move sensitive materials quickly through customs made it an ideal cover for other operations. The greenhouse humidity carried the lingering scent of industrial chemicals from Kane's assault, mixing with the fragrance of recovering orchids. Thomas Chen moved through his domain, each action precise as he prepared for a different kind of conflict. Like cultivating his rarest blooms, victory would require creating perfect conditions. Kane's organization was sophisticated, patient, using legitimate channels to establish control. But Thomas had spent decades perfecting the art of nurturing life in hostile environments. As evening approached, he completed his preparations. The greenhouse's recovery concealed new defenses, each repair incorporating lessons learned from Kane's assault. Like protecting delicate species from persistent threats, defending his community would require both patience and deadly precision. The setting sun cast long shadows through the greenhouse glass as Thomas Chen prepared for the next phase of the conflict. Some battles were won with bullets, others with patience and perfect timing. Kane's operation was about to learn that underestimating a gardener with combat experience was still a fatal mistake. Dawn broke over Millbrook's eastern district as Thomas Chen initiated his response to Kane's operation. Like preparing his most delicate orchids for cross-pollination, each element had to be perfectly timed. "Their surveillance network is extensive," Michael reported, studying feeds from hidden cameras they'd installed throughout the district. Professional teams rotating through civilian cover positions. They're building a complete picture of local operations. Thomas worked methodically among his orchids, each movement deliberate as he implemented his countermeasures. Years of nurturing rare species had taught him that sometimes the best defense was carefully guided growth. Kane's shell companies have acquired 6 more properties this week, Claire reported, analyzing property records. They're establishing a perimeter around key transportation routes. She paused, studying a document. But there's something odd about their permit applications. Thomas nodded, gently supporting a recovering Paphiopedilum. He'd noticed the pattern in their paperwork, small discrepancies that suggested rushed preparation despite their professional operation. Detective Martinez arrived quietly, parking behind the greenhouse. Federal investigation been officially redirected, she said, her voice low. But some agents are continuing unofficial inquiries. Kane's organization left traces, subtle ones, but they're there. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas monitored increased activity around recently acquired properties. Kane's operators maintained civilian cover, but their movements betrayed military precision and coordination. They're systematically targeting specific types of businesses, Marcus radioed from his observation post. Anything with specialized permits, international connections, or unique handling capabilities. Thomas continued his careful work, each action concealing his true preparations. Like cultivating his most challenging species, success would require creating exactly the right conditions. His phone buzzed. A message from Agent Cooper, operating unofficially now. Kane's operation matches patterns we've seen before. They establish legitimate business networks as cover for sophisticated logistics operations. Claire organized shipping manifests while reporting observations. They're particularly interested in companies that handle sensitive materials, she noted, places with special handling permits or customs clearance. Thomas worked steadily, his combat-trained mind analyzing patterns while his hands tended to delicate blooms. Kane's organization was creating infrastructure for something larger, using legitimate businesses as cover for more sophisticated operations. The Weber family found evidence of tampering, Michael reported, helping install new security measures. Their inventory records were accessed, shipping schedules copied. Kane's people are mapping all local business operations. Through carefully positioned mirrors, Thomas monitored professional observers, maintaining surveillance on his property. Their civilian disguises were perfect, but their positioning revealed military training. They've started pressuring suppliers, Claire said, reviewing delivery records. Several of our regular vendors suddenly have quality control issues or shipping delays. They're trying to disrupt normal operations. Thomas nodded, understanding the tactics. Kane's organization was applying pressure through legitimate channels, creating problems that only they could solve. His radio clicked, Marcus's warning signal. More unmarked vehicles were moving into position, establishing new observation points throughout the district. The surveillance network was expanding. Local banks are being difficult, Detective Martinez reported. Businesses refusing Kane's offers are suddenly facing loan reviews, credit problems. They're using financial pressure to force cooperation. Thomas worked methodically, each movement precise as he positioned his countermeasures, like protecting rare orchids from aggressive parasites. Defending against Kane's operation required understanding their methods. They're creating dependencies, Cooper explained via secure message. Establishing problems, then offering solutions through their front companies, building a network of businesses that rely on their support. Through his greenhouse glass, Thomas watched professional operators rotate through observation positions. Kane's forces were patient, methodical, using legitimate business activities to mask their true purpose. The community's starting to crack. Martinez observed. More businesses accepting Kane's partnerships just to survive the pressure. They're establishing control without violence. Thomas continued his careful work, outwardly focused on his plants while implementing his response. Like nurturing his most demanding species, success would require perfect timing and precise execution. Claire reviewed international shipping documents, her expression troubled. They're particularly interested in our special handling permits, she noted. The ones that allow expedited customs clearance for sensitive materials, Thomas nodded, understanding the strategic value. His nursery's legitimate need to move delicate specimens quickly through customs made it an ideal cover for other operations. His phone buzzed, Michael sharing surveillance data. Kane's organization had established a sophisticated network of observation posts throughout the district, all maintained under legitimate business cover. They're not just watching, Marcus reported. They're collecting data on every aspect of local operations, shipping schedules, security systems, personnel, patterns, building complete operational profiles. Thomas worked steadily, each action calculated as he prepared his response. Like cultivating his rarest blooms, victory would require creating exactly the right conditions for success. The greenhouse humidity carried the scent of recovering orchids mixed with the subtle indicators of his preparations. Thomas Chen moved. Through his domain, each movement precise as he implemented his countermeasures. Kane's operation was sophisticated, patient, using legitimate channels to establish control. But Thomas had spent decades perfecting the art of nurturing life in hostile environments. Like protecting his most delicate species, defending his community would require both patience and deadly precision. As evening approached, he completed his initial preparations. The greenhouse's recovery concealed new measures, each element positioned to counter Kane's methods. Like preparing rare blooms for challenging conditions, success would require perfect timing and execution. The setting sun cast long shadows through the greenhouse glass as Thomas Chen prepared to initiate his response. Some battles were won through direct conflict, others through careful manipulation of conditions. Kane's organization was about to learn that underestimating a gardener with combat experience was still a fatal mistake. Through his surveillance network, Thomas monitored increased activity around recently acquired properties. Kane's operators maintained their civilian cover, but their movements revealed military training and coordination. They're establishing complete control of local infrastructure, Michael observed, helping install final countermeasures. Transportation, storage, security, creating a network they can absolutely control. Thomas nodded, understanding the pattern. Like cultivating his most challenging orchids, Kane's operation required specific conditions to succeed. But those same conditions could become vulnerabilities if properly exploited. As darkness settled over the district, Thomas Chen completed his preparations. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper now served to protect his community in a different way. Like nurturing rare species, victory would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. The night deepened as he initiated his response. Some gardens required careful pruning to thrive. Kane's organization was about to discover that some gardeners understood both cultivation and elimination with equal expertise. The pre-dawn darkness cloaked Millbrook's eastern district as Thomas Chen's countermeasures took effect. Like orchids blooming in perfect conditions, each element of his response activated precisely as planned. Something's wrong with their surveillance network, Michael reported from his observation post. Their communications are showing irregularities. Professional teams are losing coordination. Thomas worked quietly among his orchids, each movement deliberate as his plans unfolded. The skills that had made him an elite sniper now served a different Purpose: disrupting sophisticated operations through careful manipulation of conditions. Kane's shell companies are facing unexpected scrutiny, Claire reported, reviewing data on her tablet. Anonymous tips triggering investigations into their permit applications. Discrepancies being discovered in their paperwork. Through his surveillance, feeds, Thomas monitored increasing confusion among Kane's operators. Their professional discipline remained, but their carefully constructed network was developing unexpected complications. Health inspectors hit 3 of their front companies this morning, Detective Martinez said, arriving with fresh intelligence. Legitimate violations found at each location. Their operational bases are being compromised. Thomas continued his methodical work, each action concealing his true activities. Like nurturing his most challenging species, success required careful attention to every detail. Their supply chain is experiencing disruptions, Marcus radioed. Shipments delayed, permits questioned, routine inspections finding problems. Their legitimate cover is developing cracks. Through carefully positioned mirrors, Thomas watched Kane's surveillance teams struggle to maintain their positions. Anonymous reports of suspicious activity were forcing them to rotate more frequently, disrupting their observation patterns. Financial irregularities are being discovered in their shell companies, Cooper reported via secure channel. Perfectly legal investigations creating significant operational problems. Thomas worked steadily, his combat-trained mind monitoring developments while his hands tended to delicate blooms. Kane's sophisticated network was facing systematic disruption through entirely legitimate channels. Their security contractors are being investigated for licensing issues, Michael noted, helping install new greenhouse panels. Professional operators are forced to withdraw to avoid scrutiny. Their surveillance coverage is degrading. Claire organized shipping documents while tracking developments. Their front companies are facing logistics problems, she reported. Customs delays, paperwork issues, regulatory complications, all completely legitimate concerns. Thomas nodded, continuing his careful work. Like protecting rare orchids from aggressive parasites, defending against Kane's operation required understanding and exploiting vulnerabilities. The community's noticing changes, Martinez observed. Kane's pressure tactics are becoming less effective as their operations face increasing scrutiny. Businesses are starting to resist. Through his greenhouse glass, Thomas monitored Kane's forces struggling to maintain their civilian cover. Professional operators were being forced to abandon positions as legitimate investigations threatened their anonymity. Their network is fragmenting, Marcus reported. Communication problems, coordination issues, operational security compromised. They're losing their grip on the district. Thomas worked methodically, each movement precise as his countermeasures continued to take effect. Like cultivating his most demanding species, success required creating exactly the right conditions. His phone buzzed, Cooper sharing intelligence about Kane's organization facing broader investigation. Anonymous tips and careful documentation had triggered official scrutiny that couldn't be easily dismissed. Their front companies are experiencing systematic problems, Claire noted, reviewing reports. Each issue is completely legitimate, but the pattern is devastating to their operations. Thomas continued his careful work, outwardly focused on his plants while monitoring developments. Like nurturing his rarest blooms, victory required patience and precise timing. Kane's operators are being forced to withdraw, Michael reported. Professional teams can't maintain positions without risking exposure. Their surveillance network is collapsing. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched Kane's sophisticated operation begin to unravel. Legitimate investigations and regulatory scrutiny were compromising their carefully constructed cover. The Weber family's fighting back, Martinez said. Others too. Kane's pressure tactics are failing as his organization faces increasing problems maintaining legitimate cover. Thomas worked steadily, each action calculated as his response continued to develop. Like protecting delicate species from hostile conditions, defending his community required understanding both strength and vulnerability. Their logistics network is compromised, Marcus observed. Transportation routes disrupted, storage facilities under investigation, security operations facing scrutiny. They're losing operational capability. Claire reviewed documentation of Kane's growing problems. Every issue is completely legitimate, she noted. Regular inspections, routine audits, normal regulatory oversight. But the cumulative effect? Thomas nodded, understanding the impact. Like nurturing his most challenging orchids, success often came through careful manipulation of environmental conditions. His radio clicked. Michael's signal confirming more of Kane's operators withdrawing from exposed positions. The professional precision of their operation was being systematically undermined by legitimate complications. They're losing control of their infrastructure, Cooper reported. Front companies compromised, surveillance network degraded, operational security threatened. Kane's organization is facing systematic disruption. Through carefully positioned sensors, Thomas monitored increasing frustration among Kane's forces. Their military training was useless against the mounting wave of legitimate problems threatening their operation. The community's regaining confidence, Martinez observed. Kane's network is losing effectiveness as their operations face continuing disruption. Their control is slipping. Thomas continued his methodical work, each movement precise as his countermeasures took effect. Like cultivating his most delicate species, victory required perfect timing and execution. The greenhouse humidity carried the scent of recovering orchids mixed with the satisfaction of plans unfolding perfectly. Thomas Chen moved through his domain, each action contributing to the systematic dismantling of Kane's operation. As evening approached, he monitored the cumulative impact of his response. Kane's sophisticated network was being taken apart, piece by piece, each element compromised through entirely legitimate means. The setting sun cast long shadows through the greenhouse glass as Thomas Chen's countermeasures continued their work. Some battles were won through direct conflict, others through careful manipulation of conditions. Kane's organization was discovering that underestimating a gardener with combat experience was still a fatal mistake. Like nurturing rare species. In hostile environments, Thomas understood both cultivation and elimination with equal expertise. The night deepened as his response continued to develop. Some gardens required careful pruning to thrive. Kane's operation was being systematically pruned through perfectly legitimate means, their sophisticated network falling apart under mounting pressure. Thomas Chen worked quietly among his orchids, each movement deliberate as his plans bore fruit. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper now served to protect his community through careful manipulation of conditions, creating perfect circumstances for Kane's operation to self-destruct. Morning light filtered through the repaired greenhouse as Thomas Chen surveyed his domain. Like an orchid reaching full bloom, his countermeasures had created perfect conditions for their intended effect. Kane's organization is collapsing, Michael reported, arriving early with fresh intelligence. Their front companies are facing simultaneous investigations, professional operators withdrawing to avoid exposure. The entire network is unraveling. Thomas worked methodically among his recovering plants, each movement deliberate as he monitored developments. The skills that had made him an elite sniper had served perfectly in dismantling Kane's operation. Through careful manipulation of conditions, Federal Task Force moving in, Detective Martinez announced, entering quickly. Anonymous tips and documented evidence triggered multiple investigations. Kane's entire infrastructure is compromised. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched professional operators abandoning their positions throughout the district. The sophisticated network that had threatened his community was dissolving under systematic pressure. Their shell companies are toxic now, Claire reported, reviewing the latest developments. Financial irregularities, permit violations, regulatory issues, everything perfectly documented and completely legitimate. No one will touch them. Thomas continued his careful work, each action concealing his satisfaction as years of combat. Experience served a different purpose. Like nurturing his most challenging species, victory had required perfect timing and precise execution. "Kane's here," Marcus radioed suddenly, moving toward the nursery, alone. Thomas watched through carefully positioned mirrors as Victor Kane approached the greenhouse. The former Special Forces operator moved with military precision, but his frustrated expression revealed the impact of recent events. "You understand what you've done," Kane called out, entering the humid space. "Months of preparation, millions in investment, sophisticated infrastructure, all compromised through perfectly legitimate channels." Thomas continued tending his orchids, each movement careful and deliberate. "Some gardens require particular conditions to thrive," he replied quietly. "Others need careful pruning to prevent aggressive growth." Kane moved further into the greenhouse, his military training evident in how he assessed the environment. "You used our own methods against us, created problems that couldn't be solved through force or influence, turned legitimate oversight into a weapon. Like cultivating rare species," Thomas responded, gently supporting a recovering bloom. "Success often depends on understanding both growth and elimination." "The federal investigation is expanding," Kane said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Shell companies exposed, front operations compromised, professional teams forced to withdraw. You've destroyed years of careful preparation." Thomas worked steadily, his combat-trained mind alert, while his hands remained occupied with his plants. "Some threats require direct confrontation. Others can be eliminated by creating the right conditions. You turned the entire district against us," Kane continued, watching Thomas work. "Used our pressure tactics as evidence, our professional operations as proof of a larger conspiracy. Made legitimate businesses our greatest vulnerability. Communities like gardens require protection from invasive species," Thomas replied, calmly. "Sometimes the best defense is encouraging natural resistance." Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas monitored federal teams moving into position around the nursery. Kane's arrival had triggered carefully prepared responses. "You were never just a gardener," Kane said, studying Thomas's movements. "The nursery, the orchids, perfect cover for someone with your particular skills. We should have realized sooner." Thomas continued his methodical work, each action precise and controlled. Some talents can serve different purposes. Patience, precision, perfect timing, useful for both nurturing life and eliminating threats. "The organization will recover," Kane warned, though his tone lacked conviction. "Other operations, different approaches. You've only delayed the inevitable." "Some gardens require constant attention," Thomas responded, finally turning to face his opponent. "Protecting them becomes a permanent commitment." Detective Martinez entered quietly, followed by federal agents. "Victor Kane," she announced formally. "Federal Task Force has some questions about your organization's activities in the district." Kane's expression remained controlled, but his posture revealed his understanding of complete defeat. "Well played, Gardner," he said quietly. "You created perfect conditions for our elimination without ever taking direct action. A master class in patient strategy." Thomas returned to his orchids as Kane was led away. Through his greenhouse glass, he watched federal teams securing locations throughout the district. The sophisticated network that had threatened his community was being systematically dismantled. "Kane's entire organization is exposed," Cooper reported, arriving to supervise the operation. "Shell companies, front operations, professional teams. Everything documented through legitimate investigations. They're finished in this district. Thomas worked steadily, each movement precise as he tended to his recovering plants. Like nurturing his most delicate species, protecting his community had required perfect understanding of both growth and elimination. Claire organized shipping documents while monitoring developments. "The community's already changing," she observed. "Businesses are reopening, people regaining confidence. Kane's network is completely neutralized." "They never understood what they were facing," Michael noted, helping repair final damage from earlier conflicts. "Thought they were dealing with just another target, never realized they were up against someone who understood patient strategy." Thomas continued his careful work, each action focused on restoring his greenhouse to its peaceful purpose. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper had served perfectly in protecting his community through subtle means. "The federal investigation is expanding to other districts," Martinez reported. "Kane's organization had similar operations in multiple cities. Your evidence exposed their entire network." Through carefully positioned sensors, Thomas monitored the district returning to normal activity. Like a garden recovering from aggressive parasites, his community would grow stronger from the experience. "You never fired a shot," Cooper observed, watching Thomas work. "Created perfect conditions for their self-destruction through entirely legitimate means. Impressive strategy." Thomas nodded slightly, focusing on a delicate bloom. "Some threats require direct confrontation. Others can be eliminated by understanding and controlling conditions. Like cultivating rare orchids, success often comes through patient preparation." As evening approached, Thomas Chen surveyed his restored domain. The skills that had once served in warfare had found perfect application in protecting his community through careful manipulation of conditions. The greenhouse humidity carried the scent of recovering orchids, mixed with the satisfaction of perfect victory. Like nurturing his most challenging species, defending his community had required both patience and precise execution. The setting sun cast long shadows through the greenhouse glass as Thomas Chen returned to his peaceful work. Some battles were won through direct conflict, others through careful cultivation of perfect conditions for success. Kane's sophisticated operation had been eliminated through patient strategy, dismantled piece by piece without a single shot fired. Like protecting rare species from aggressive threats, victory had come through perfect understanding of both growth and elimination. The night settled over Millbrook's eastern district, now free from Kane's influence. Thomas Chen worked quietly among his orchids, each movement deliberate and precise. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper had served to protect his community through careful manipulation of conditions, creating perfect circumstances for threats to eliminate themselves. In his peaceful greenhouse, surrounded by the rare blooms he'd spent decades nurturing, Thomas Chen continued his work. Some gardens required protection through force, others through patient strategy. His community would thrive again, stronger for having faced and overcome sophisticated threats through perfect execution of careful plans. The final orchid of the evening bloomed under his careful attention, its delicate petals opening in the growing darkness. Like all his victories, this one had come through perfect understanding of both cultivation and elimination, protecting life through masterful control of conditions. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.